Welcome to another presentation. In 1601, an event took place which, had it been successful, could have changed the course of the British monarchy. At the heart of this was Henry Wriothesley, 3rd Earl of Southampton, believed by some to have been the son of Elizabeth I. He was imprisoned in the Tower for his part in the so-called Essex Rebellion, where he remained until the Queen died in March of 1603. For some years I've been intrigued by a painting of him while he was still imprisoned, and I thought it worthwhile investigating it further. This is the result of that study. In the first part of the presentation, we're going to look at the events leading up to his incarceration and what happened when he was in the Tower. In the second part, we're going to take a close look at two very similar portraits which depict him at the end of his imprisonment. The aim is to investigate why they were painted, why there were two of them, and what were the messages. Once more, there are lots of interesting people waiting to meet you. May I remind you that an illustrated PDF of this talk is available by clicking the link on the YouTube page. So how did the Earl of Southampton end up in the Tower? Let's turn back the clock to the middle of the last decade of the 16th century. The Elizabethan court was becoming increasingly fractious. The ageing Queen refused to name a successor, and those in power were keen to ensure that they remained so with a new monarch. Power lay in the hands of these two men. Lord Burleigh, the jobbing lawyer, who during Elizabeth's reign had enriched himself to the extent that he became the wealthiest man in the country. He died in 1598, and his son Robert Cecil, who took over the reins. There were those who were in with the Cecils, and there were those who were not. The former group included Francis Bacon and Sir Walter Raleigh. The latter group consisted of many of the young courtiers who had fallen foul of the system of the Court of Wards, something I've touched on before. Essentially, if a wealthy man died prematurely, his son was taken into the care of Lord Burleigh and the lands given to the highest bidder to administer on behalf of the youngster. On reaching maturity, there was a large payment to be made and a proportion of the ongoing profits. This led to lifelong financial problems and resentment. The first victim of this iniquitous system was Edward de Vere, whose lands were taken by the Earl of Leicester, followed by Roger Manners, the Earl of Rutland, Robert Devereux, later the 2nd Earl of Essex, and his sister Penelope, and lastly Henry Wriothesley, 3rd Earl of Southampton. These people had every reason to be disgruntled and fearful of a continuation of the Cecil regime under the new monarch. Robert Devereux was very much the favourite of the Queen during the 1590s, but Elizabeth continued to depend on the advice of the Cecils. The court was thus split into two groups, each with an extensive intelligence network. Discussion of the succession was a treasonable offence, but that didn't stop advances being made. Curiously, both groups at this stage seemed to favour James VI of Scotland to succeed the Queen. Communications were made from Cecil by secret letters in which individuals were referred to by numbers, and from Essex through his sister Penelope, who wrote regularly to the King. The centres of dissent were Essex House on the Strand and Drury House, the lodgings of Henry Wriothesley. Robert Cecil continued to brief against Essex, who was sidelined to Ireland to battle with the Earl of Tyrone in 1599, taking with him Henry Wriothesley. Over the next 2 years, relations between Essex and the Queen deteriorated. It all culminated in an abortive rebellion in 1601. On the 8th of February, Essex, together with his followers, headed for Paul's Cross in an attempt to apprehend the Mayor of London after the sermon and rouse the City of London in his favour. Cecil promptly hailed Essex as a traitor, thereby dispersing with fear many of Essex's followers. It was all over later that day, as the rebels surrendered at Essex House. it's somewhat unclear what Essex had been hoping to achieve. Removal of Cecil was an obvious aim, as, on top of all other resentment, he'd become suspicious that Cecil was planning both to assassinate him and make an alignment of England with Spain. Succeeding as this without deposing the Queen would have been very unlikely. Catherine Chillian, in her book Shakespeare Suppressed, reveals some interesting correspondence. Henry Percy, 9th Earl of Northumberland, the richest of the northern lords, wrote to James VI of Scotland. He reported that Essex had thought it scandalous for our nation that a stranger should be our king. James would have been considered a stranger as he was not born in England, making him legally ineligible to succeed Elizabeth. In another letter, Northumberland states that Essex wore the crown of England in his heart these many years, and therefore far from setting it on your head, if it had been in his power. The implication is that Essex planned all along to take the crown for himself, or indeed to give it to Henry Rosalie. The trial for treason of Lord Essex and Southampton took place on the 19th of February 1601. Damaging evidence against Essex was given by several individuals, including Sir Walter Raleigh, Francis Bacon, and of course Sir Robert Cecil. The Earl of Southampton appeared to have been guilty by association and attempted to defend himself in this vein, pleading ignorance of the law, humbly submitting himself on the mercy of the Queen. By the end of the day, both had been found guilty of treason and sentenced to death. Essex was beheaded on the 25th of February within the Tower grounds, followed some days later by his co-conspirators. Southampton's life hung in the balance. His wife and mother wrote pitiful letters in his favour. The latter argued that if Queen Elizabeth had not so relentlessly maintained her dislike of him, denying access to her at court and refusing him generalship of the horse in Ireland and the governorship of Connaught, he might never have turned to treason. As late as March the 25th, spectators came to Tower Hill, drawn by a rumour that Southampton was to be executed there that day. Heavy criticism came from an unexpected quarter, that of Thomas Arundel, the husband of Southampton's sister. On the 18th of February 1601, he wrote a treacherous letter to Sir Robert Cecil in an attempt to distance himself from his brother-in-law. I am more than ashamed at the foulness of his fault, yet can I not but grieve for being allied to one that hath so foully blotted his allegiance, and that to such a princess, under whom I presume he might have lived happy many years, had not the devil owed him a shame. I humbly desire that my unspotted faith to my ever reverenced princess may, by your favour, be recommended. Then in an unsigned statement the mask slips and his motive is revealed. I do truly love you, and therefore wish that every man should love you. The matter is this: if Her Majesty shall think my Lord of Southampton a fit man to receive life and mercy, God forbid, but I should desire it, and be glad of it. But if he must needs die and forfeit all, then my request is that by your favour the fee farm on that little land which he is now possessed of may be granted to myself at such a reasonable rent as you should think good of. Public opinion favoured clemency, and it appears that the government felt that mercy to Southampton might help conciliate this. A letter from Robert Cecil to Sir George Carew reflects this. It remaineth now that I let you know what is like to become of the poor young Earl of Southampton, who merely for the love of the Earl hath been drawn into this action, who in respect that most of the conspiracies were at Drury House, where he is always chief, are much disadvantaged of arguments to save him. And yet, when I consider how penitent he is, and how merciful the Queen is, and never in thought or deed, but in this conspiracy he offended, as I cannot write in despair, so I do not flatter myself with hope. Southampton did not spend his days in the Tower in a dark dungeon. Like most political prisoners, he had chambers of his own. He paid £9 a week to the lieutenant of the Tower, and his lodgings were probably fairly spacious and well furnished. His confinement, however, was initially very strict, and small events must have loomed large in a very monotonous life. On March the 22nd, 1601, the Privy Council wrote to Sir John Peyton, Lieutenant of the Tower, concerning Southampton's health. Whereas we do understand that the Earl of Southampton, by reason of the continuance of his quartern ague, hath a swelling of his legs and other parts, you may admit Dr. Paddy, who is acquainted with the state of his body, in your presence to have access to him, and to confer with him for those things that shall be fit for his health. Now the wording here is very interesting. Southampton had only been in prison for 4 weeks. The implication of continuance and the fact that Dr. Paddy knew about his problems suggests that his illness was present before he was incarcerated. The council was asking for treatment, not a diagnosis. His illness was almost certainly malaria. It was quite common in England during the 16th century. This may come as something as a surprise, as it's usually thought to be a disease of warm climates. The distribution in England remained fairly constant. The data for the figure comes from around 1850. The notable areas are the low-lying fenlands and the Thames estuary. There was a medieval warm period stretching over several hundred years, right up to the middle of the 16th century. Indeed, it was warm enough to bathe in the Rhine in January. Around 1560 there was an abrupt change to a colder period called the Little Ice Age, lasting around 200 years. Diseases established during the warm period, such as malaria, persisted during this period. The word ague entered English usage from France in the 14th century. It's derived from the Latin word acutus, meaning sharp or pointed. A fièvre ague was a sharp or acute fever. Malaria has intermittent severe fevers, the frequency of which defines the underlying parasite. Quotidian fever occurs every 24 hours, tertian every 3 days, and quartan every 4 days. Each episode is related to the parasites bursting from the red cells of the blood. The organism responsible is Plasmodium malariae, one of the 6 species of the protozoan Plasmodium. It is spread by the mosquitoes of the genus Anopheles, preferring brackish waters along river estuaries. Untreated malarial infection can return periodically over the years. As time passes, patients become partially immune and develop a milder illness. Southampton was described as having swelling of his legs and other parts. This is almost certainly related to the rare complication of kidney involvement of the disease. This can take several forms, but all can result in kidney failure, leading to fluid retention and a build-up of waste. In many cases it can be fatal, but in others kidney function returns. The repeated episodes of severe fever, kidney impairment and anemia would have been extremely debilitating for him. So how did he get it? Well, I can't be sure, but there are 2 possibilities. Firstly, you will note that it was common around Southampton, and Titchfield, the home of the Rosalie family, was close to the Solent. Secondly, he may have picked it up during his campaign in Ireland, where the disease was rife at the end of the 16th century. Shortly after his incarceration, Southampton sent an effusive petition and a confession to the Privy Council, and a letter to Robert Cecil. His aim to be spared his life and possibly to be forgiven and set free. Here are some extracts which amply display his eloquence. My lords, I beseech your lordships, be pleased to receive the petition of a poor condemned man, who doth, with a lowly and penitent heart, confess his faults and acknowledge his offences to her Majesty. Your lordships, I think, cannot but find, by the proceedings at my trial, that my heart was free from any premeditate treason against my sovereign, though my reason was corrupted by affection to my friend whom I thought honest, and I by that carried headlong to my mine without power to prevent it. She, the Queen, who hath been ever so renowned for her virtues, and especially for clemency, will not extend it to me, that do with so humble and grieved a spirit prostrate myself at her royal feet, and crave her pardon. O let her never suffer to be spilled the blood of him that desires to live, but to do her service, nor lose the glory she hath gained in the world by pardoning one whose heart is so without spot. Thus recommending myself and my suit to your lordship's honourable consideration, beseeching God to move you and to deal effectually for me, and to inspire her Majesty's royal heart with the spirit of mercy and compassion towards me, I end, remaining your lordships most humbly of late Southampton, but now of all men most unhappy. Around 2011, a manuscript containing 254 miscellaneous folios was discovered in the British Library by Professor Lara Crowley. Among them was entitled a poem, The Earl of Southampton, Prisoner and Condemned, to Queen Elizabeth. For many reasons which I won't go into here, it's considered to be genuine, and was written during the early prison sentence, possibly in February or March of 1601. It's in rhyming couplets 74 lines long and in iambic pentameter. Hank Whitmore, the Oxfordian Shakespearean scholar, has pointed out similarities in the words used and the sentiments expressed with Shakespeare's sonnet sequence. However, this is no Shakespearean sonnet. Here are some extracts from it. Not to live more at ease, dear prince, of thee, but with new merits, I beg liberty to cancel old offences. Let graces so, as oil or liquor else will overflow, swim above all my crimes. If faults were not, how would great princes then approach so near God in pardoning me? Wisdom and valour common men have known, but only mercy is the prince's own. While I yet breathe and sense and motion have, for this a prison differs from a grave. Prisons are living men's tombs, who there go, as one may, sith say the dead walk so. And in the wrinkles of my cheeks tears lie, furrows filled with rain, and no more dry. And so sleep visits me, when nights half spent as one, that mean nothing but compliment. Horror and fear, like cold and ice, dwell here. The light of your countenance, and the same morning of the court favour, whereat all aim, vouchsafe unto me, and be moved by my groans, for my tears have already worn these stones. I think you agree this encapsulates his despair and desolation. Something changes Elizabeth's mind about executing him. Maybe this helped her decide. Hank Whitmore thinks there is much more to it than that, which I'll come to later. In July of 1601, the Privy Council took note of his long sickness, which he hath had before his trouble. In October, the Privy Council, having heard that Southampton had of late grown very sickly, permitted his wife at convenient times to repair unto him. In August of 1602, the Lieutenant of the Tower transferred the weak and very sickly Southampton to a more salubrious lodging, but warned the Privy Council that without some exercise and more air than is convenient for me to allow, without knowledge from your honours of Her Majesty's pleasure, I do much doubt of his recovery. He was permitted to leave his chambers and walk in the fresh air on the leaden roof above them. By the end of the year he was receiving visits from his old friends of the Essex faction, It's not recorded whether or not this included Edward de Vere. One interpretation of the sonnets claims it did. It's likely that Sir John Peyton, the Lieutenant of the Tower, and others treated Southampton with as much consideration and gentleness as they dared. They knew that the old Queen would not live forever, and that her probable successor, James VI of Scotland, would almost certainly release Southampton and give him a position of power and influence. King James was in fact already regarding the prisoner with a solicitous eye. Writing from Scotland under the code name 30 to the Earl of Northumberland, code name 0, he spoke feelingly of poor Southampton, who lives in hardest case, and added, if in any sort your means may help to procure him further liberties or easier ward, pity would provoke me to recommend it unto you. Life after the Tower. On the 24th of March 1603, the Queen died. On the 5th of April, James VI of Scotland set out for London. Before doing so, he sent ahead an order for Southampton to be released. He explained that he was acting out of concern for his health and that he expected to be greeted by him at the end of his journey. On the 12th of April, the royal warrant arrived and Southampton and a fellow prisoner, Sir Henry Neville, were released. 2 weeks later, even before James met the Privy Council, Southampton was presented to him at Theobald's house in Hertfordshire, the residence of Robert Cecil. In fact, the king was so taken with the house, he took it for himself. Shortly afterwards, the rewards came quickly. On May the 16th, a royal pardon was given for his offence committed in Elizabeth's time. On July the 9th, he was installed as a Knight of the Garter. On July the 21st, he was formally made Earl of Southampton once more. And on the August the 20th, he obtained the farm of Sweet Wines, which had produced most of the Earl of Essex's income. In September, he was made captain of the Isle of Wight. Literary dedications also started to flow again. This one, written anonymously as a dedication to a book by Thomas Powell, is intriguing. It's entitled A Prelude upon the Name of Henry Rosalie, Earl of Southampton. Ever, whoso beholds this leaf therein shall read a faithful subject's name, he shall indeed the grey-eyed morn in noontide clouds may steep, but traitor and his name shall never meet, never. Firstly, it had nothing to do with the rest of the book. Secondly, it's one of a number of occasions when there is a play on the words ever and never, which refer to Edward de Vere. The grey-eyed morn is taken from Romeo and Juliet. In the years that followed, Henry Wriothesley developed cordial relations with the King and Queen of Denmark. But he was never a favourite at court. He was quick to get into arguments, and he was treated with some suspicion, being arrested on several occasions, most notably after the death of Edward de Vere in 1604. He spent a good deal of time improving his estates in Titchfield and Bewley. He was an astute businessman, helping set up the state of Virginia. He died, along with his eldest son, of a fever, probably due to the plague, while campaigning in the Low Countries in 1624. Now we have some knowledge of the sequence of events. Let's begin to look at the portraits. The one on the left hangs in Welbeck Abbey in North Nottinghamshire, and the one on the right at Bolton House in Kettering, Northamptonshire. Most experts attribute the paintings to John de Critz, who lived from 1551 to 1642. He was one of a number of Flemish painters in the English court. In 1603 he was appointed sergeant painter to James I and painted a wide range of portraits. Richard Goulding, late of Welbeck Abbey, speculated that the artist was John de Critz's brother-in-law, Marcus Geerhardt the Younger, whom we've met before with regard to the pregnancy portrait. In fact, the portraits are quite close together, around 70 miles apart as the crow flies. Well, how on earth did they get there? Well, as usual, this is an interesting story, which I will present to you in slightly abbreviated form, so hopefully you'll manage to stay awake. This is Thomas Rosalie, 4th Earl of Southampton, the surviving son and heir of Henry. He lived at the family seat in Titchfield near Southampton and in central London, where he rose to the position of Lord High Treasurer. Thomas Rosalie was married 3 times and widowed twice. From his first marriage to Rachel de Massou, he produced Lady Elizabeth and Rachel Rosalie. From his second marriage, he produced another Elizabeth. Thirdly, he married Frances Seymour, and there was no issue. On his death in 1667, Lady Elizabeth and Rachel were co-inheritors of his estates. He left his London home to his widow, Frances Seymour. Lady Elizabeth was gifted the Titchfield estate and Rachel the estate of Stratton, also in Hampshire. So let's follow what happened to Lady Elizabeth. Lady Elizabeth married Edward Noel, 1st Earl of Gainsborough. Their son, Rosalie Baptiste Noel, was 2nd Baron Noel of Titchfield and was born in 1665 and lived in Place House, in other words, Titchfield Abbey. He married Catherine Greville, and they had a daughter, Lady Elizabeth Noel, in 1688. The Baron died in 1690 and his wife in 1704, leaving Lady Elizabeth as the sole heiress. And now for the interesting bit. Lady Elizabeth married Henry Bentinck, 1st Duke of Portland, in 1704, bringing with her the estate of Titchfield, resulting in his being Marquess of Titchfield. In 1708, William Bentinck was born, who later became the 2nd Duke of Portland and Marquess of Titchfield. His wife was Margaret Cavendish Harley. It is someone we've met before. This was the joining of some very influential and indeed rich families. Margaret Cavendish Harley was the only child of Edward Harley, 2nd Earl of Oxford, the great collector of art, and Henrietta Cavendish Hollis, who at the time of her marriage was the wealthiest woman in the land, bringing with her both Welbeck Abbey and Wimpole Hall in Cambridgeshire. Thus we have a direct line between Lady Elizabeth Rosalie, the daughter of Thomas the 4th Earl, and William Bentinck, 2nd Duke of Portland. Down this line came the Welbeck Abbey portrait. Its route is verified by those who noted its presence. In 1731, Clement Walcock, a Titchfield steward, recorded the portrait in the Titchfield House pictures with Virtue's notes. In 1740, the Rosalie collection had moved to Bulstrode House in Gerrard's Cross, one of the main houses of the Dukes of Portland. Margaret, Duchess of Portland, accumulated a large collection of natural history and antiques. It was reported to have been at Bulstrode in 1775. It's unclear when the portrait was moved to Welbeck Abbey, but the house was sold by the 4th Earl of Portland in 1811. In summary then, the Welbeck portrait came down the family line from Lady Elizabeth Rosalie, eldest daughter of the 4th Earl. So what of the other portrait? You are looking at a drawing of Bourton House and gardens in around 1735. The estate lies about 3 miles north of Kettering in Northamptonshire. At the time of the drawing, the gardens were extensive, to say the least. The house itself is tucked away in the distance at the top. And here is the house today, the original Tudor section, encased very much in a French style. The house is surrounded by beautiful lawns, lakes and canals. And here is the Great Hall. with some of the extensive collection of tapestries. Just on the extreme right is a painting of a lady combing her hair, whom some of you may recognise. And here she is in her full glory. This is Elizabeth Vernon, the wife of Henry Wriothesley. You can see that her hair is down, so this would have been painted before her marriage in 1598. And next to her is plain Mr. Henry Wriothesley in a very fine gilded frame. And how on earth did he end up in rural Northamptonshire? Well, this is another interesting story involving the other Elizabeth Wriothesley. As we've seen, this Elizabeth Wriothesley was the product of Thomas, the fourth Earl's marriage to Lady Elizabeth Lee. Elizabeth was only 9 when she died, and presumably lived with her father and his third wife until he died when she was around 21. Elizabeth did very well for herself. In 1662 she married Jocelyn Percy, the 11th Earl of Northumberland, who died only 8 years later in 1670. Then she married Ralph Montague, 1st Duke of Montague, producing in turn John, the 2nd Duke. Now, the Montagues weren't short of money. This is their house in Bloomsbury. You know it better as the British Museum. John married Lady Mary Churchill of the Spencer family and produced Lady Mary Montague, who married a George Brudenell, 4th Earl of Cardigan. In 1749, John, 2nd Duke of Montague, died, and his son-in-law, Lord Cardigan, inherited his estates and changed the family name to Montague. They had 2 children. First, John Montague, who was created Baron Montague of Bourton in 1662, thereby reviving a family title. He died in 1770 at the age of 35, unmarried and with no children, and the barony became extinct. It was recreated for his father, that would be Lord Cardigan again, and then passed on by his sister to her children. And here is Lady Elizabeth Montague, shown here in a stunning portrait by Gainsborough. She married Henry Scott, the 3rd Duke of Buccleuch, an ancient Scottish baronetcy, thereby linking Bourton House to the Buccleuchs. From about this time, Bourton House was left empty for almost 200 years, but was well looked after because of its fine state rooms. Its many fine tapestries were stored rolled up. And this is Mary, Duchess of Buccleuch, widow of the 8th Duke, who during the 20th century brought the house back to life. When she died in 1993, the 9th Duke opened the house for arts organisations. The process of restoration has been continued by the 10th Earl. During his tenure, the house has been filled with a remarkable collection of works of art and tapestries, some of which are very fine indeed and well worth a visit. It seems likely, therefore, that the portraits of Henry Wriothesley and his wife remained in other properties of the Buccleuch family and moved to Bourton House relatively recently. So we have a direct line from the 4th Earl of Southampton down to the 10th Earl of Bourton House. It's certainly interesting how the line survived in spite of a lack of available sons to carry on the name. So I think you will agree that both paintings have very plausible lines of descent. What do we want to know about them? Well, we want to know why and when they were painted, why there are 2 of them, what is the relevance of the differences between the portraits, and do they have any hidden messages? In order to study the portraits, I'm going to enlist the aid of 2 additional versions. The George Perfect Harding watercolour from the early 19th century is shown on the left, and this was in possession of Richard Goulding, curator of paintings at Welbeck, and the John L. Riley version, painted in 1904, which now hangs in the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust in Stratford-on-Avon. Both were copied from the Welbeck version. I'm not trying to confuse you, it's just that some features are clearer in the different paintings, which you will see as we go along. First, let's look at the Boughton House version. We have a rather thin-looking man with a very long face and fingers, wearing a full-length black robe. There's a mullioned window behind him, which has several broken panes. On the window ledge sits a black and white cat, in front of which is a book. In the top right hand of the painting is a picture of the Tower of London, below which is some text inscribed on a brown panel. Let's take each feature in turn. Firstly, the face. It's undoubtedly that of Henry Rosalie, although as I demonstrated in a previous presentation, it is longer than in any other portrait of him. His expression is passive and his skin clear. His hair cascades down in a somewhat unkempt and unruly way. Next, the clothing. The actual painting is very dark, with little detail visible. This image was taken professionally, but it's still difficult to interpret. The Earl is wearing a full-length black garment, buttoned at the front. I came across the term suit of woe. It occurs in Hamlet, Act 1, Scene 2, when Hamlet talks about hidden internal grief for his father, far surpassing his outward display of lost. "'Tis not alone my inky cloak, good mother, nor customary suits of solemn black. I have that within which passeth slow. These, the outward signs, but trappings and suits of woe." So it seems to me it's very likely that he is wearing mourning attire. If so, for whom? Surely it's for the Queen, who had died so recently. After all, Henry Wriothesley very much portrayed himself as a naive follower of Essex, and this display of loyalty to the crown might suit him well with a new monarch. I'm sure that you've also noticed that his left arm is in a sling, which I will explain shortly. Here are my thoughts on the clothing. All the previous descriptions say the subject is standing. I believe that he's sitting on the bench behind him. The reason is simple. If you have an arm in a sling, it's not possible to rest your hand on your upper thigh in a standing position. In addition, his right elbow is resting on the window ledge for support. The direction of the thigh is as shown, and the hand naturally aligns with it. We need to explain also the following points. Firstly, this curious pattern. Secondly, this pale area here, and of course the sling itself. The key to all of this is in the shoulders. On his right is the standard tunic shoulder, and on the left the shoulder piece is upturned. If we lighten the image, some details emerge. The subject is wearing a cloak over his robe. This is, however, only over the left shoulder, with the outer edge hanging down to the bench behind. The line of the front of it is here. There is a change of direction level with the adjacent pale area, suggesting it may be some sort of motif in the fabric. But what of the lower pale area? George Perfect, in his watercolour, picks out other details. There's a fold on the right, shown by the arrow. There's a possible area of fabric overlay, shown by the large circle, and there's another unidentified element at the bottom of the picture. My working hypothesis is that the top element is a design feature within the cloak, and the bottom element is either a panel within the cloak or the lining of it exposed as it drapes over the bench. The sling consists of a length of fabric with a fur or leather edge. It forms a waistband and the sling itself, and is secured out of sight at the back. The question, of course, is why is he wearing a sling? Well, there's nothing wrong with his hand, and no sign of joint swelling to indicate inflammatory joint disease. An elbow problem would be very unlikely. This is not a simple sling, but one which binds the arm to the body, restricting shoulder movement. So I think that's where the problem lies. He might have had a dislocated shoulder, but this is very unlikely as there's no report of any violence. It might have been related to his malaria, which can cause muscle aches, but probably not enough to require immobilization. It's possible that he had shoulder arthritis, which can occur as a rare complication of syphilis, but this is very much a late-stage problem. However, there is a common but very painful condition, the so-called frozen shoulder, medical term adhesive capsulitis, which occurs usually in slightly older individuals. Its cause is unknown, it occurs spontaneously and is very painful, as I can vouch from personal experience, and causes increasing stiffness. It resolves over a couple of years with a complete recovery, and this would fit with the fact that he appeared to have been fully fit later in life. It's interesting to note that in spite of his arm problem, he was able to don a tight-fitting garment over his shirt. My interpretation of the sling is that it's a signal, an outward expression that he's suffering pain in response to his imprisonment. In a prominent position is the Earl's left hand. This image was taken directly from the original painting. The shirt cuff bears similar lace edging to the collar. Around the wrist are either 5 bracelets of orange coral beads or a single loop folded on itself. There is no visible evidence of a chain, even at high magnification. There are many vague references to the use of coral as a cure for all manner of disease, and this would fit with its use here. There is a gold ring on the left little finger with the gold mount and clasps. There is a dark stone with what appears to be a gold design at the right-hand end of indeterminate shape. On the right hand is a gauntlet with a leather glove and a crenellated cuff with black bows. The index finger is extended, pointing downwards, with the other fingers grasping the left glove. On the window ledge there is a book which partly overhangs the edge of the shelf. The binding of the book is on the right. You can see in this enlargement that the open end is on the left. This means we're looking at the back of the cover of the book, and it displays the Rosalie family coat of arms, a cross and 4 hawks, with a 5-pointed crown above. In other words, it comes from the family library. The strange objects to the left of the book have intrigued me for some time. There appear to be 2 metal rings attached to the edge of the window ledge. There is a length of material of a bluish-green colour which rises vertically from the base of the image and then appears to disappear into the edge of the book. It then reappears under the book, passes down one ring, up through the other, and then is draped over the edge of the ledge. This end appears forked, but I think this is just the way the material lies. You can see it is frayed at the other end and shaped by passing through the rings. At the top of the book there's a second piece of material with 2 loops, one of which appears to emerge from the shelf itself, and the second passing through the edge of the book. Unfortunately, the Welbeck version is no more helpful. However, the watercolour of the Welbeck painting by George Perfect Harding seems to confirm my interpretation. I hazard a guess that this was a mechanism securing the book, which is probably a Bible, to the ledge by tying the ends, keeping it private and away from prying eyes. I don't think it's a diary. Firstly, it's very thick, and secondly, it's beautifully bound. It may have the message that the subject has read his Bible all the way through and has made his peace with God. The cat perched on the ledge has obtained near mythical status. Her name is Trixie. She accompanied Southampton for some of his time in the Tower. You will note that she fixes her gaze upon you in a rather menacing way. How she got there is where the mythology starts. In 1793, Thomas Pennant wrote a book entitled Some Account of London. In it, he recorded a story about the cat. A very remarkable accident befell Henry Wriothesley, Earl of Southampton, the friend and companion of the Earl of Essex, in his fatal insurrection. After being confined there a small time, he was surprised to find his favourite cat, which had found its way to the Tower, and, as tradition says, reached its master by descending the chimney of his apartment. I have seen at Bulstrode, the summer residence of the late Duchess of Portland, an original portrait of this Earl in the place of his confinement, in a black dress and cloak, with a faithful animal sitting by him. Perhaps this picture might have been the foundation of the tale. It seems to me much more likely that the Earl's wife brought the cat in to keep him company on one of her visits. In the top right-hand corner of the portrait is a small painting of the Tower of London. It has a curious shape with a curved left bottom corner. In the foreground are 4 swans, and around the tower an odd collection of buildings. It has been interpreted as showing the Traitor's Gate entrance from across the Thames. However, this engraving from a similar period shows us the supposed view, with the Traitor's Gate at the front. The painting shows a very much narrower tower, perhaps for reasons of space, and the edge details are very, very ill-defined. This is a drawing of the tower in 1597. As you can see, there is a wharf separating the complex from the river. The moat went all the way round the tower complex. If we enlarge the lower part of the image, then I think it seems to me that much more likely that the view is a portrait across the moat rather than the River Thames itself. Below the tower is a strange brown rectangle, which is featureless apart from some text and numbers. This image was taken from the professional photograph, in which there is no distortion. The interesting point is that the left-hand edge of the panel is not vertical, and the painting of the tower appears to be shifted to the right. The text reads "In vinculis invictus," which I'll come back to shortly. Below this we have the date of the incarceration, February the 8th, 1600. This is the old style date, when the year ended on Lady Day, 24th of March. So to us this is 1601. Then the years are given, strangely without the 1 in front. Because April is after Lady Day, the last year is 1603, so he was in prison for just over 2 years. Another odd thing is the use of colons to divide up the words and numerals. The most important feature is that the date of release in April is not given. This would suggest that the painting was done while the Earl was still in prison, but after the Queen had died, i.e. between the 24th of March and the 12th of April, 1603. So what are the differences between the two portraits? First, the sizes of the Welbeck and Boughton versions. The reported sizes are very similar. The slight difference may be due to the extent of the frame overlap or trimming of the canvas. 109 centimetres by 87.6 for the Welbeck and 104.4 by 87 centimetres for the Boughton. You can see that the Welbeck portrait has a bluish-green hue in the image provided for me by Welbeck Abbey. In reality, the actual portrait colours are very much closer to the Boughton version. I've chosen to use this image because it was professionally taken and there is no distortion. Interestingly, by comparing it with the copy made by Riley, the image was much warmer. The most obvious thing is that the Welbeck portrait has neither the picture of the tower nor the inscription. I've compared the two portraits in the following way. I've scaled the face on the Welbeck to the same as the Boughton and superimposed it with 50% opacity. The yellow line indicates the edge of the image provided for me by Welbeck, which I can confirm is how the original portrait looks. You can see that the Welbeck has either been trimmed or covered by the frame, which is quite wide. The details of the painting are a very good match, apart from the leadwork in the windows. If there were a disparity, the image would be very fuzzy. The point of interest, however, is at the top right-hand corner, where the dark panel on the Borton lines up precisely with the edge of the window recess in the Welbeck. There is no doubt that the addition of the tower picture and the inscription distorts the geometry of the whole picture, which suggests to me that it was a late addition, an afterthought. I'll show you what I mean. Let's take out the figure and then fade the image. This is the outline of the window. This is the front of the window ledge. This is where the ledge meets the wall, and this is the edge of the window recess. Just for completeness, this is the back and front of the seat. So I think that the small picture and the text were added afterwards, but before he was released from prison. The artist was willing to sacrifice the integrity of the painting by adding these elements, so they must have been important. The last point is that the portrait is titled in the Welbeck version as Earl of Southampton. The name Henry Wriothesley above is scarcely visible. I'm told by the curator of pictures at Welbeck that many of the paintings in the collection have this type of title. In the Borton version, which I've lightened, there is no evidence of text, although interestingly the perspective differs slightly. So what was the purpose of the image of the tower and the underlying text? A partial answer may be this. Let's go back to the Latin text, in vinculus invictus. Invinculus is a legal term, meaning in actual custody. It also has a secondary meaning, applied figuratively to the condition of a person who is compelled to submit to terms which oppression and his necessities impose on him, i.e. wrongful imprisonment. Invictus means undefeated or unbowed. The picture of the tower could be taken to symbolise the judicial power of the state or monarchy, the text stating that in spite of the oppression he has been forced to endure, he remains undefeated. Now it might be supposed that this political version needed to be seen by someone in power. Like this man, James VI of Scotland. I found one unsubstantiated story that the painting was a rush job done in only 5 days and taken for the king to see before he left Edinburgh on the 5th of April. It sounds very unlikely for it to have been painted and delivered to Edinburgh in only 11 days. It's possible, but it's also equally possible that it went with Henry Wriothesley when he was presented to the king at Theobald's house. This was around the 24th of April. The painting could have been made of very powerful statements and impart messages even without words spoken. I suggest that once viewed and its messages interpreted, the painting would have been returned to Henry Wriothesley. So what happened next? Well, you may remember that prior to the Essex rebellion, Southampton was lodging at Drury House. He did, however, have a place of his own in London. This was almost certainly being rented out while he was away fighting. This is part of the Agas map of London from around 1561. Here is Chancery Lane, and just where it joins Holborn, there is a collection of buildings with a fairly large tract of land. This was originally Lincoln House, later renamed as Southampton House, and today has been developed as Southampton Buildings. This was the London base of the Earls of Southampton for around 100 years. Following his release from prison, Henry Wriothesley engaged in court affairs and would have spent his time either here or in a Grace and Favour apartment in the palace. G.P. Ackrig tells us that in the years following his release, Henry Wriothesley engaged in a busy social life involving extravagant house parties. The portrait would have provided a very suitable backdrop for such occasions. This social trend resulted in the development of the immense so-called prodigy houses. Indeed, in 1617, Henry Wriothesley gained possession of the manor of Bloomsbury for £600. He applied to develop the area, but permission was refused. It was his son Thomas who set about the task of doing this in the 1670s. And this is the result: Southampton House and its square. It was later renamed Bloomsbury Square. You can see the house in the centre distance. Just off to the left of the picture stood Montague House. Elizabeth Thomas's youngest daughter was born in 1646 and married in 1662, 5 years before her father died. I propose that the Boughton portrait hung in this house, and that was obtained by Elizabeth after her father's death in 1667, when the house was gifted to the Earl's third wife, Frances Seymour, who had brought up Elizabeth, but one assumes would not have had any sentimental attachment to the painting. Interestingly, the house came back into the hands of Rachel Rosalie, Thomas's second daughter, later in the century, and she died there in 1723 at the age of 87. She'd married William Russell, the son of the Earl of Bedford, and the house was later renamed Bedford House. So why are there two versions? Well, if we go back to the beginning, you'll remember that Elizabeth Rosalie, the eldest daughter of Thomas IV Earl and his first wife, appears to have kept the Welbeck version at Titchfield. Her half-sister, also Elizabeth, who does not seem to have inherited an estate, kept the Boughton House version. I'd like to propose that the two paintings serve different purposes. One, the Welbeck, was a family portrait as a reminder of that part of the Earl's life and kept at the family seat. The other, the Boughton, was highly political. It has been suggested that both portraits were painted at around the same time, and that in the Welbeck version the tower picture and text were overpainted. I'm not so sure about this. I've examined the relevant area of the Welbeck portrait with a magnifying glass. The top layer of paint is quite thin, and the lighter colour of the remainder of the wall is clearly visible. Although I'm not an expert on techniques employed by Renaissance artists, there are two things which make me think that the Welbeck is a copy of the Boughton. Here is a comparison of the left hand of both portraits. The coral beads are lacking and colour and less distinct in the Welbeck, and the ring on the Welbeck is simply a black area with white highlights. If we look at the area of the cat, then in the Welbeck, the window bars and the edge of the window frame and the window ledge are clearly visible through the animal. You can see this even more clearly if the image is inverted. This is not so with the Boughton version. My proposal is that Henry Wriothesley commissioned a copy of the Boughton version hanging in his London home at some later date, not necessarily by the same artist. The purpose was to be hung at Place House in Titchfield. The tower and the text were omitted as there was no purpose for them in this version. Now, what might any underlying messages be? Here I'm going to speak specifically about the Boughton House version because of its additional features. It's fair to say that this is where things start to get a little murky. You remember from previous presentations that there is evidence that Henry Wriothesley was the son of Elizabeth I and Edward de Vere, the so-called Tudor Prince theory. He was never recognised by the Queen because of his behaviour, but his heritage may have saved his life after the Essex Rebellion. In other words, she couldn't bring herself to execute him, or for that matter to recognise him as her heir. Proponents of this theory, such as Hank Whitmore, have posited that a deal was struck that preserved his life, provided that he relinquished all claim to the throne and that his father and chief supporter, Edward de Vere, disappeared from public life. In his book, The Monument, Whitmore expounds his view that many of the sonnet reflect Henry Wriothesley's time in the Tower. This theory has led to speculation that there may be hidden messages within the portraits to signal to James I that he had nothing to fear from the Earl, and that he was a trustworthy supporter of the King. There certainly was an element of James being suspicious in terms of what he'd been told about the real reasons for the Essex revolt, i.e. that he would not have gained the throne had it been successful. Helen Heitzman Gordon, an American academic, has written a paper entitled Rosicrucian and Freemason Symbols in the Tower Portrait of the 3rd Earl of Southampton. The principle behind this may be to signal to the new king and court a shared interest and belief in mysticism. Many of her ideas do not stand up to scrutiny. There are several, however, which are interesting, and I include them just to stimulate thought. Firstly, the lace on the collar is a row of triangles. Secondly, the window panes are triangles and diamond-shaped, both later symbols of Freemasonry. Not very convincing. Thirdly, the red beads are Kabbalistic. The Kabbalah being an ancient Jewish sect characterized by wearing 7 red strings around the wrist. It was worn for protection, good luck and strength. Here, however, we have only 5 rows of orange beads, possibly a folk remedy. And the fourth thing was the fold in the book tie resembles the Greek letter sigma and is reflected in the shape on the other side of the body. Personally, I think that the tie is just hanging over the edge of the window ledge. Then there's the cat. It's been claimed that it represents Bastet, a mythical Egyptian deity, simply I think on the basis of Egypt being an important origin for mysticism. My view is that it's just a black and white cat, so really not very convincing arguments. There may, however, be something in the next ones. The black bows resemble the crosses of the Knights Hospitalier of the Order of St. John. Although, to be fair, this is usually shown as a white cross on a black background, gauntlets with a similar motif are available for purchase today from Freemasonry websites, and black gloves may be worn by senior members of the organisation. The combination of the cloak off the shoulder and the gloved hand is reminiscent of the frontispiece, which was later used in 1640 for the 2nd edition of the sonnets. And thirdly, the downward pointing finger is a Masonic symbol. Rather surprisingly, there is much literature on pointing fingers in Renaissance art. Unfortunately, they seem to point in all sorts of different directions. Here are 2 examples in portraits of Sir Thomas Challoner. Its significance is much harder to define. I did, however, come across an initiation ceremony in the Scottish Rite Masonry published in 1905. The individual was required to point downwards. Now I'd like to take you back to the inscription. If you search the internet for Inviculus Invictus, every result that I could find referred to this painting. I'm not saying the words have never been used together, but it must be very rarely. The words have a certain eloquence when enunciated as a result of the similar lettering. I've already said that there are some odd things about the inscription, particularly in its layout. Why, for example, is there such a large space between the N and V of the first line, and where is the word sed, Latin for but, in chains but unbowed? Is there a code here? Well, here's just a suggestion. It's possible to form a triangle by using the outlines of the words Inviculus Invictus. Within this triangle there are 2 words and the number 813. Now this may be a link to the Kabbalah, which, as I mentioned, is a Jewish mystic philosophy. In 1911, Westcott published a book entitled Numbers, Their Occult Power and Mystic Virtues. The number 813 is the numeration of the word Ararita, an important Kabbalistic word, the letters being collected from the initials of the Hebrew sentence, which is shown there. The translations of the sentence vary, but the simplest is that this individual is of the highest caliber, unique and of the first order. Might this be a description of the man who's been chained but undefeated? I've talked a lot in previous presentations about the use of numbers to express closeness to God in 16th century philosophy. As far as I'm aware, we do not know Henry Wriothesley's sacred number. Might it perhaps be 3? 3 equal sides to a triangle representing the Trinity, the number 3 representing himself as the 3rd Earl of Southampton at the base within that triangle, the quaternary within the tertiary, which John Dee was so keen to emphasise, i.e. the Trinity and yourself. There is something else that caught my eye. It's something being lined up by the layout of the letters. Here's my suggestion. If you extend the upstrokes of the V's in Invictus, each of them passes the left-hand side of the V's in Vinculis. The upstrokes also cross to produce a W. We've seen this before, if you remember, in the title page of Venus and Adonis. The 2 V's in Vinculis also form a W, and the last letter in both lines is forming WS, WS. To have William Shakespeare, aka Edward de Vere, as your supporter, now that would be something. This particular W produces 4 V's, 3 upright, the Trinity, and 1 upside down, the individual. Once again, the sign of the quaternary within the tertiary. You may also remember this. In a previous presentation, I looked at the evidence of Henry Wriothesley being the son of Elizabeth I. I noted the extraordinary likeness between the Earl, aged 30, to his mother when she was just 13. And in Sonnet 3, Edward de Vere says of Henry Wriothesley, "Thou art thy mother's glass, and she in thee calls back the lovely April of her prime." The tower portrait is on the left, and here I've plotted a map of the shape of the face. In the centre, we have Mary Brown scaled up to the same size and blended with the original image, and on the right is the map overlying the face of Mary Brown. It's a perfect fit, even to the extent of the hairline. Is it too perfect? Could this be a clever way of demonstrating the parentage of Henry on the succession of James I? And could Sonnet 3 have been written to accommodate it? It's interesting to compare the shape of Henry Wriothesley's face in different portraits. On the left he's 27, on the right he's 46. Here's the level of the chin in the tower portrait, and here the comparison of the other two. And here is the level of the hairline in the tower portrait, higher than both in the other paintings. As an interesting summing up, I thought I'd speculate on what King James might have seen on seeing the portrait and meeting Henry Wriothesley. The first of all, I think he saw a broken man. Just 3 years earlier, he looked like this, tall, upright, proud and exuding power, and impeccably attired. Now he looked dreadful, thin, hair unkempt, unable to stand for a portrait, and in obvious pain. The contrast between the word Invictus, undefeated, and the poor soul in the picture is stark. James would have seen the mourning clothes signalling devotion to the Queen. He would have seen the Bible closed after being read from cover to cover, peace made with God. He would have also noticed the cloak off the shoulder and the gauntlets, the St. John's crosses and the downward pointing index finger, and recognise a member of a mystic brotherhood. He would have seen the cat, perhaps showing a softer side to the man's character. He also might have picked up deeper messages in the text. This man is a great person of the first order, and even his secret number being 3. Then the face, thou art thy mother's glass, I'm no threat to you. I may give up my own right to the throne. James may have also picked up the reference to William Shakespeare in the 2 WS's. He was a great fan of Shakespeare, and I think inconceivable that he didn't know who Shakespeare was. James would have seen what he meant to see, but could he trust him? He would be wise to take Machiavelli's advice and keep his enemies closer, which of course is exactly what he did. He knew how popular Henry Wriothesley was, and his restoration played well with the masses, and also allowed him to keep a close eye on his activities. Henry Wriothesley remains one of the most interesting characters of the late 16th and early 17th centuries, from ward of court to the fair youth of Shakespeare's sonnets, to patron of the arts, to successful entrepreneur and soldier. It is, however, for his involvement in the Essex rebellion and his incarceration in the Tower that he's probably best remembered. And of course that nagging question of whether or not he was the child of the Queen. I hope you found my analysis and history of the paintings of interest. I feel there is good evidence to explain why there were two versions and how they came to be where they are. I have no personal experience of Freemasonry, so I would be grateful if someone might like to comment on some of the observations of possible links in the imagery. Similarly, I put forward the hidden meaning of the text tentatively, and if anyone has any further ideas, I'd love to hear from you. I'd also like to express my thanks for the courtesy and hospitality shown by the curators of art at both Welbeck Abbey and Borton House in allowing me to view the paintings and for allowing me to use images of the portraits. It has been for me a great privilege to study these wonderful paintings at close quarters. As always, thank you very much for watching.